Hey everyone, Mitch coming in from the Commander Score Studio. Welcome to the show. So, today's episode might just be a little bit controversial because on today's episode, well, I'm saying that you shouldn't be playing this card in Commander basically ever. Basically. There are very few exceptions, and I will mention an exception or two, and actually I have made this exception before, and I promise it makes sense in that exception. But the vast majority of time, you should not be playing this card that I'm going to be bringing up right now. Now, I was shocked to see that, yeah, Temple of the False God still sees play in 10% of eligible decks. Years ago, I did an episode where I talked about this card and how, yeah, you shouldn't be playing this. And 378,000 decks to its name, more than 378,000 decks to its name. Temple of the False God is a really, I'm not going to say it's not a problematic card, but it is a card that is emblematic of poor deck building sometimes. Let's just say that. So, and here's the thing, and we'll get to like why it might be in so many decks right now still, and just how it should be perceived in my mind. So, Temple of the False God is a land that can tap for colorless, which is very, I mean, it's a very eye-catching and very, just, you think about all the possibilities of that, right? You think about what you can do with 2 mana from a land, right? It's free from a land. I get extra mana. What other lands can do that? Like, outside of Ancient Tomb, like, not many at all. Activate only if you control 5 more lands, though. So, there is a massive requirement for that, like, and it might not seem all that massive, right? Because like on other cards, like, hey, if you've got 5 lands or whatever, like Scoop Mob or whatever, you get an extra effect, that kind of stuff, right? But when it comes to a land, there's a different expectation of it, because a card like this can lead to, and does lead to, again, some poor deck building decisions, and then also just dead games for not only the player, but sometimes just a dead game for the entire table. And it's up to everyone. Everyone can make their own decisions. I guess I should start off with that. And maybe I'm a bit too harsh in this card. Everyone can make their own decisions and play whatever cards they want. You can play with whatever pet cards you want, even if some people say they're bad, they're terrible, whatever they are, you shouldn't play them. You can play whatever cards you want, all right? And you are entitled to do that. I am saying, though, if you are trying to improve your deck building, one thing you need to do right now, unless you have very specific decks that I'll talk about at the very end, you need to cut Temple of the False God from every single one of your decks. Every single one. Because the problem with this card is that when it comes to lands, what you want from them is you want consistency. You want to be able to hit your land drop, know that you have 1 more mana than you did last turn or whatever, plus whatever ramp you're doing, to make sure that you can get going with your game, right? You can get yourself set up. That's what lands are for. Use them as a resource to get out more resources in other cards. So if you are, turn 1, land, turn 2, land, play a rampant growth, play a ramp spell, that is amazing. That's a great start. That's what you want to be doing, right? In Commander, you want to get those resources out. Temple of the False God is a card that you absolutely do not want to see in your opening hand, even though the vast majority of the time you're like, oh, I want like at least 3 lands in my opening hand. Maybe 2 plus a mana rock or whatever, but like you want, typically, at least I do, 3 lands in your hand. But if Temple of the False God's one of those lands, you're disappointed. You are saying, oh no, this card is basically useless until I get out 5 or more lands. So literally, if I just have this in my hand, it also can lead to bad game decisions, because you can say, well, I've got 3 lands and I've got, a good amount of lands in this deck, so I'll draw into another land. I absolutely will. Cool. And then you end up sitting 8 turns waiting to draw into another land, and you don't. I mean, not 2 more lands, I guess, at that point, right? If you start off with 3. This can lead to no games for you, dead games for you, essentially. It can also lead to, then dead games for the rest of the table, right? Because the rest of the table is not going to target you. The rest of the table is not going to take advantage of the fact that you're there. And just, it can kind of, it's not up to you to not ruin a game for the rest of the table, I guess is what I'm trying to say. But it can take away the fun, not just from you, but from others as well. Because it is a card that, again, is that pie in the sky, like, oh my gosh, what big plays I can make. I get 2 mana from a land. Amazing. Why isn't everyone playing this? And then you realize just kind of the percentage chance that you have of just destroying your early game, which is the most important part of every single game. It just sets yourself up for the rest of the game, essentially. And if you're playing this card and you have this in the early turns, it is a garbage card. It is a card that is a nothing card in your hand, and you want your lands to be cards that you can count on. And you cannot count on this. Basic lands are so much better than this. Leagues better than this card. It's not even close. Now, conversely, again, like I said, this card sees play in 10% of decks, and we'll get to potentially why part of that is here in a little bit. But conversely, a card like Edge of Autumn, which I absolutely love, I'm a big proponent of, only sees play in 1% of eligible decks out there. And it's kind of the opposite when it comes to a risk that you are willing to take. Again, Temple of False God is a risk you're willing to take because you're like, oh, well, I'll definitely hit 5 lands, right? This one is on the opposite end. Sorcery for 1 and a green. If you control 4 or fewer lands, search your library for a base land card, put that card on the battlefield tapped, then shuffle your library. It is a rampant growth with a restriction. But the restriction is that this is going to help you out early in the game, but it doesn't give you that effect middle or late game. When it comes to early in the game, you want to make sure that you are ramping. But if you're already at 5 lands, you're typically good to cast the vast majority of your spells, and you are set up. And typically, once you're at 5 lands, you're not like, I really wish I could cast a rampant growth. You're usually set up properly enough that you've got enough resources that you can utilize them for whatever you need to do, essentially, right? Are there going to be times that you whiff with this, and you're like, gosh, you know what? I really wish I had that. Yes. But there's also times late game when you draw into a rampant growth, and you're like, what am I going to do with this? I already have 10 lands in play. I don't need another one. I need a different card. This is the kind of card that's like, oh, okay, late game. It's also very good because you sacrifice a land to cycle this away and replace it. So this is the kind of card that is a risk worth taking because early game, it's still effective. And again, that is the most crucial part of the game for basically every deck out there. You want to make sure that you are setting yourself up. You want to make sure you don't have dead turns that do nothing because you don't have lands in play. And you go with Temple of the False God, just like you have lands in play, but one of those lands does nothing for you, and then you're probably short on mana for other things too. Versus this gets you the mana, but some people out there just aren't willing to take that risk with this card because they're like, I really wish I could ramp with this later. It doesn't matter that you can't ramp later for the vast majority of decks out there, okay? And again, this is technically better than rampant growth late in the game because if you draw into it, it's better to recycle it out. So again, the kind of push and pull of like, where are you willing to take that risk? Again, early game or late game, it should be, middle game, I guess, with this one, but you should not be willing to take the risks early game because you need to set yourself up, okay? Now, when it comes to a reason why Temple of the False God, again, sees so much play, and again, it is not the fault of Commander players out there, especially new Commander players out there, people who are just new to Magic in general, is because Wizards, for whatever reason, keeps putting it in pre-con decks. Goodness gracious, Wizards. So, it sees play in 70% of Zul'Dok Void Gorger decks according to EDH Rec. And I guess I should say that all these stats are based on EDH Rec, which is not a perfect resource, but the best resource that we have when it comes to percentages, okay? Anyways, 70% of Zul'Dok decks on EDH Rec. It came in the pre-con. So that means that, I guess if you built your own Zul'Dok deck, like I did essentially, that was not based on the pre-con, then yeah, I did not put that on the, I didn't put Temple of the False God in there. Also, if you did build a Zul'Dok deck from your pre-con, you might have just put the entire list of the pre-con online. It gets pulled by EDH Rec, and it's just pulling, the pre-con list essentially, so it's in there from that. Or it's also, kind of the in-between, where you built the pre-con, you made some adjustments, and you maybe took it out or whatnot. Still, 70% of Zul'Dok decks utilize this card, and that is incredibly high. Now, one of the things people might say is that, well, it is a colorless land, right? So you're not at a disadvantage with that in a colorless deck because you don't need to fix your mana, right? Sure, that is true. And Zul'Dok does have, an effect that essentially says, you know what, you want more mana, and you do. It's a 7/4 Eldrazi for 5 in a colorless. Colorless spells you cast from your hand with mana value 7 or greater have Cascade. So yes, you want to be able to get to 6 mana to get this out and 7 mana to cast your other things. So sure, I guess having a land that can give you 2 would be appealing. That being said, you need to get there. And again, if you don't get there to 5 lands at an appropriate time, you are going to be getting way behind all of your opponents because your deck has a ton of things that are high on the curve. Also, you are not in green, which means that when it comes to your land ramp, you're counting on like Wayfarer's Bauble, and that's essentially it. So you need to count on mana rocks, and therefore you're not increasing your land count through land ramp, and therefore you're not really able, unless you're including a bunch of inefficient ways to get a bunch of lands into your hand essentially versus ramping, you're not really including those kind of cards in the deck, or at least you should not be. And when it comes to your percentage chance of ensuring that you hit Temple of the False God at the right time, you're only running 36 lands in this deck. According to EDH Rec, that is what Zul'Adok decks run on average, is 36 lands. That is nowhere near enough to ensure that when you hit Temple of the False God, it's going to be at the right time. And again, if it's in your opening hand, it's a dead card most of the time, unless you're like, oh, I'm keeping a 5-land hand, which I don't recommend doing a lot of the time anyways. So this is the type of card, again, that Wizards, for whatever reason, is putting in, again, Commander Precons, and players that are new might be like, oh, cool, yeah, land that taps for 2. Of course this is good in this deck. It is a card that, again, is going to lead to dead games, do nothing games for you. And sure, it's also going to have times when it shines, but the times that it does not shine are going to stand out a lot more to you when you're just sitting at the table doing absolutely nothing for 5 turns because one of your lands does absolutely nothing. Now, you might be thinking, okay, this is one example, right? That is a precon. Wizards put that in there already. That means that, well, other decks, that are somewhat similar that weren't precons won't have nearly as many Temple of False Gods, right? Because they weren't made by Wizards and the card was just shoved in them. Okay, let's take another example. Another colorless commander that is very high mana value, yes, Kozilek, the Great Distortion. Now, take a guess really quick, just off the top of your head, how many Kozilek decks do you think have Temple of False God? Just take a quick guess. If Zul'Adok was 70, what is this one? Again, this one is not a precon commander. There's not a deck built around it already from Wizards. The answer is 67%, only 3% different. So again, what that tells me essentially is, again, 2 colorless commanders that both, again, are high mana value essentially. I mean, this one's 10 mana value itself, but the other one is like high mana value in that it's 6, and then also the spells you want to cast are high. This one essentially says, oh yeah, we also want a land that can tap for 2. Yes, but again, this is a card that can definitely whiff, does definitely whiff, can really throw your entire strategy off because early on you're like, I'm counting on this, and then it doesn't happen. You also don't have access to land ramp in colorless. Really, again, it's out of Wayfarer's Bauble. And again, you really count on getting your commander out in a Kozilek deck. So it can definitely ruin your entire plan before the game even really starts. A 12/12 Eldrazi for 10 mana. I probably should have said this already. 8 colors. Cast a spell, you have fewer cards in hand than 7. Draw a card, equal difference. Menace, discard a card with mana value X. Counter target spell with mana value X. It's a really cool commander. And again, yes, there are certain lands out there that are not basic lands that you're going to be utilizing with this commander. And you can utilize an amazing amount of utility lands with this commander because a lot of lands that just have 4 colors, you can't just shove a ton of those into a deck that has 1 or more colors because, 2 or more colors really, because you need some mana fixing. This kind of a deck, though, you can I can use colorless lands, it's fine. But you need to make sure that you are hitting your land drops so that you can ramp properly. And again, in colors, you're ramping with mana rocks, so you need to make sure you do that. And again, when it comes to Kozilek, how many lands do you think that a typical Kozilek deck does use? Because again, if it was, say, 42, 43 plus or whatever, your percentage chance of Temple of the False God being online when you actually draw into it is going to be a lot higher, obviously, with more lands in your deck. It's 36 still. It is the exact same thing as Zul'Adok, the exact same number as Zul'Adok. And again, there's going to be a lot of times where you have Temple of the False God in play and it's doing nothing for you. And then you're going to have a dead game when you do absolutely nothing because you were counting on that land to be active. Now, one more time. Let's talk about a more recent commander. You got to say, I guess Zul'Adok was pretty recent too. So it's not like Wizards stopped at some point once people realized Temple of the False God was bad and stopped putting in decks. They keep putting in decks. Whoever is at Wizards right now putting it in decks, please stop. You are either bad at constructing decks or you're intentionally making new players play bad cards that are not good for the decks. Especially, again, we just talked about colorless commanders and how, they can utilize colorless utility lands. Davros, a 3-color deck. What are you doing, Wizards? A 3/4 alien scientist with menace for 4 mana in Grixis. 3-color commander. Beginning of your end step, create a 3/3 black Dalek artifact creature token with menace. If an opponent lost 3 more life this turn, then each opponent lost 3 more life this turn faces a villainous choice. Draw a card, the player discards a card. This is a 3-color commander with a 3-color deck that needs mana fixing. You need lands that can tap for the very least 1 color. And sure, you maybe include maybe 1 or 2 utility lands in that just tap for a cost, a couple maybe at the very most. Mirror Landscape, sure, because that one actually ramps you and is guaranteed to ramp you, right? Mirror Landscape's amazing. That being said, This one does not fix your mana, and also, again, it can just be a dead card that destroys you. Now, unlike Zuladak, which again has 70% of its decks have Temple of the False God, Davros, Dalek Creator, has 34% of its decks that have this card in it, which means that either, again, and this is a Precon Commander, I should say. This is a Wizards Precon Commander, and the Temple of the False God was included in those decks. So again, either players built it, realized that was a bad card in it, and took it out. A lot of the players did, or again, players who built the deck outside of it from being a Precon did that too. And again, when it comes to the number of lands, you got to be saying, okay, it's got to have a decent amount of lands in it to include it. No, it just has 37. So technically more than the giant Eldrazi for some reason, but still, according to Trek, 37 lands on average. Yes, this is a card that, again, can just destroy entire games for you. When it comes to the risk-reward, it is most definitely not worth that reward. Most definitely not worth that reward at all. And when it comes to these kind of cards, too, there's kind of a debate, and I fall on one side of it, and some people might fall on the other side of it, like a Mirror Landscape, or, Blighted Woodland, or, yes, even Temple of the False God. Some players out there consider these to be like a ramp spell in the deck. Like, oh, it does the ramping, so it's a ramp spell in the deck. That means I can cut other ramp spells, like, Rampant Growth, Edge of Autumn, those kind of things. I don't need to use as many if I have that. Wrong. Especially with Temple of the False God, again, because you're just already hurting yourself more by not including more ramp spells to ensure that you can get more lands into play. For decks that, again, can get lands into play. But do not count on your lands for ramp, because the lands that do ramp are also inefficient. Like Mirror Landscape is inefficient in the way that it does ramp. So is Blighted Woodland, and so is Temple of the False God, just inherently, because it can fail. So make sure you're still utilizing, again, like on average, right, 10 ramp is what you should be utilizing in a deck. Just on average is like the recommendation, okay? Not every deck needs that. Some decks need more. Some decks need less. But again, don't just be like, well, why don't I just cut my Rampant Growth? Because I can throw a Temple of the False God in there. It does the same thing. It doesn't, because it's not nearly as consistent or efficient. And yes, it is a card that will not whiff. I guess you could just whiff because you don't have one in a green to cast Rampant Growth or Edge of Autumn, but your Temple of the False God very much can whiff. Now, like I said earlier again, I would not recommend Temple of the False God in Zul'Duk. I would not recommend it in Kozilek. I would not recommend it in Davros. I would not recommend it in basically any deck out there. Like 99.999% of decks out there, I will not recommend it for. That being said, I have used it in a deck. And you might be saying, well, then you're being hypocritical, because you're saying, like, it shouldn't be used ever, and, these are the reasons why. You're going to whiff with it. Why would you utilize it? Well, that's because I utilize it in a deck that I built that literally cannot whiff with it. Child of Alara. There's a couple different variations of this kind of a build, essentially, where, hey, Child of Alara is it's a commander deck that I would recommend asking your playgroup. In fact, you need to ask your playgroup ahead of time if they're okay playing against this deck, and people at your LGS too, because it is a commander that can be quite obnoxious. A 6/6 legendary creature avatar trample that costs Wooburg when it dies to all non-land permanents that can't be regenerated. This is a repeatable board wipe from the command zone. And the deck that I built around it is 99 lands. The reason why Temple of the False God is good in that deck is because you will never miss a land drop. You are guaranteed, no matter when you draw that card, whenever you draw Temple of the False God, you will have enough lands either in your hand to be played or already in play to ensure that you can get the most out of it. And you never have to play it before you actually want to play it. Or again, you can literally, if it's in your opening hand, you can guarantee that on turn 5, you can play it as your 5th land, and it will tap for 2 because you have other lands, right? It's 99 lands. You're guaranteed to get your land drops because you're only drawing into lands. And again, the same thing with, like, if you have like a 70 land deck or an 80 land deck or 99 or 97, whatever kind of land deck, if you have an absurd amount of lands, yeah, you can consider the card, absolutely. And you might be thinking, like, Child of Alara, it's like, well, you need Wooburg, you need mana fixing. You got enough mana fixing in that deck that by the time, you need to actually play Temple of False God, you can. And then it's just a great way to reduce the cost, essentially, of commander tax. It's basically, it pays for one commander tax itself, right? So there are exceptions, again, to the rule of never play Temple of the False God, in my opinion. But again, it's up to you. If you want to play the card, if it's a pet card of yours and you love it, absolutely. Just saying, if you want to improve your deck building skills, I would recommend cutting it from literally every single deck you have, unless, again, you have a glut of lands in a deck, essentially, in a deck that is built around that. Or if you have like a 20 ramp spell deck plus 40 lands or whatever it is. If you can guarantee that like 99% of the time you're not going to whiff on Temple of False God, great. If you can't guarantee that, don't utilize it because, again, it's just going to destroy games for you. And that's what you're going to remember. You're not going to remember the times that you're like, oh, on curve, I hit it with my 5th land, and I tap for 6, and I play this big spell, and yeah, it went really well. You're going to remember the games that you just sat there staring at your 3 lands in play, with Temple of the False God being one of them, and it's been 5 turns, and you've drawn nothing but non-land, and you can't play anything, and you're like, please just let me draw a land. Then you finally draw your 4th land, and then you're drawing 4 more turns, and then you finally draw your 5th land, but the game's already over anyways because you've been sitting at the table doing absolutely nothing. In contrast, a card like Guildless Commons, it does the exact opposite of something like Temple of False God. Now, this one should not be utilized like in every single deck either, obviously. This is not for every deck. And like bounce lands are great when it comes to mana fixing. I'm just giving Guildless Commons as like the colorless, example to contrast this, okay? Other bounce lands actually can fix mana, which is great. That being said, this one can be utilized even in a colorless deck. Enters the battlefield tapped, enters the battlefield to return a land you control to its owner's hand, tap for 2 mana. Again, taps to the exact same amount as Temple of False God. It obviously doesn't, ramp you in the way that Temple of False God does because you are putting a land back in your hand. This one also shouldn't just be overused in decks that don't have enough basics in them because you want to be able to bounce a land back in your hand that comes into play untapped, because you don't want to be like, okay, I play a tapped land. Next turn, I play my Guildless Commons, which comes into play tapped, bouncing my tapped land back to my hand. So that next turn, I can play my tapped land. Too many tapped lands coming in there. It's going to slow you down. You're basically like a turn behind in that way. That being said, when played properly, Guildless Commons is amazing because you're like, okay, cool. Guildless Commons and other bounce lands, I should say, in the right deck. Amazing because, okay, cool. I tap my forest in play. All right, I put this in play tapped. I bring my forest back to my hand. I still got the mana out of that forest in that turn. And then essentially, next turn, I've got another land drop. This is a kind of card that helps you hit your land drops. This essentially counts for 2 lands instead of kind of like Temple of the False God, which sometimes counts as 0 lands. So this is a way to ensure that you are hitting your land drops versus the exact opposite again with Temple of the False God. In Guildless Commons, he's play in only 1% of eligible decks out there. So he's play a lot less, again, in those Kozilek decks, in those Zul'Dok decks, when it should be seeing more play than Temple of the False God, because it does what you need to do. It helps you hit your land drops. So, again, I urge you. Again, and I know there's some big fans of Temple of the False God out there, and that's completely fine. I've got my pet cards too, all right? I definitely do, all right? But you gotta sometimes know when something, if you're trying to get improving your deck building skills, that kind of stuff, you gotta know when to let go sometimes of some of those pet cards. You just do. If you want to improve your deck building skills and say like, okay, like I don't want those dead games. I don't want those times where I just do nothing and sit there. One way to do that is you cut your Temple of False Gods out of every single one of your decks, except for the ones that, again, are like, I'm guaranteed, like my 99 lands deck, guaranteed to make this work. It is literally, it cannot fail, because I will play it on turn 5 or turn 6 or whenever I need to play it, and it will have enough lands in play at the time. So, please, 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 goodness gracious, 2 things. Number 1, again, up to you. Again, Wizards can't dictate what you do. Even if they built the precon and you bought the precon, you can still take that card out and you can swap it out with literally any basic land is better. Like, just put any of the basic lands in for that precon and it works better. Then also, Wizards, this is for you. Stop putting Temple the False God in decks. I mean, literally, if we just look at what it's been in lately, it's been in Fallout, Murders at Karlov Manor, Lost Caverns of Ixalan, Doctor Who, Wilds of Eldraine, Commander Masters, March Machine Commander, Phyrexia, literally just like most recent decks, right? I mean, most years, like within the last year, the last 2 years, it's been in so many Commander precons still, and this is like after players like basically started saying like this card is terrible, and Wizards keeps putting it in decks. Like just look at all the prints it's been in. Just look at all these. I mean, there's like 2, there's sometimes, yeah, it's in 2 of the precons too, so there you go. Just, it's in so many of the decks out there. It is absurd. Wizards, again, Warhammer decks as well. Just so many precon decks utilizing this card. For what reason? And again, it's not like they're all, again, it's like Davros or whatever that one's called. It's just, it's like commanders that like aren't ones that just have an absurd amount of lands in them. Or ones that, again, are ones that can actually even utilize this. It's going to be a dead card for players. It's going to lead to bad gameplay experience for them. So please, please, please. Apparently it was a gold border card at one point. Good for that. Probably worked in a deck that actually utilized it properly. Yeah, it's just a card that, again, really, really, really should only be utilized in very specific scenarios. Or again, if it is a pet card and you love it and you want to utilize it, utilize it. I'm not trying to take away from your fun. But I'm trying to say that if you do want to build better decks, and Wizards should be encouraging that, and finally Wizards is starting to put like decent lands in decks, actually, and decent amount of ramp in decks instead of like 4 ramp spells and then like Temple of the False God. It's like, no, Wizards, give players actually decent decks to play so that they can learn the right ways to play Commander and the most effective ways to play Commander, essentially. Give players the resources that they need and build these decks properly, and stop putting in Temple of the False God. Literally, just again, for the past year, there's been absurd amount of Commander decks that I would think that they wouldn't be doing this, and they do, even a 3-color one. It's ridiculous. But yeah, in the comments below, I would love to hear your thoughts on this. What do you think? Do you think I'm completely off on this? Is Temple got one of your own favorite cards, and you're going to keep it in the deck? And that's fine if you want to keep it in. So yeah, let me know in the comments what your thoughts are on all this. And of course, thanks again, and have a good one. This show and episodes like this one are possible thanks to viewers like you. If you're looking for an easy way to help support this show, make sure that you like, share, and subscribe. Also, hit that bell notification icon so you don't miss any new episodes. You can also go check out our playmats and other merchandise at thecommandersquarters.com. We also have a ton of brand new t-shirt designs in stock, so make sure you check out those as well. Another easy way to support this show is with our TCG Player affiliate links. So whether you're buying a deck or individual cards, you can use this general link right here or one in the description. And the final way that you can support this show is by supporting us directly by becoming a patron. There are many benefits to being a patron, and I truly couldn't do this without all of their support.